Right, welcome back. Tremaine, what was quite therapeutic for Tremaine. Tremaine, I hope this helps you with getting to sleep. Look, I'll just do this quite quickly, going over what we covered in class yesterday. I'm in the office, it's period one. The chances of me being interrupted are quite high. So this will be quite a sort of quick synopsis of what we covered yesterday, which was the Siege of Tyre and that wonderful quote, "I will show you, you are part of the mainland." And as we know, Alexander did exactly that. So here we are, Tyre. Alexander has conquered all thus far, and Tyre is here on the shores of the eastern Mediterranean Sea. And as we talked about, Tyre is a fortified, was a fortified island, and the people of Tyre felt very safe on that island. There had been a history of invasions and various kings trying to take Tyre, but none had succeeded. And so they did have some confidence that they could certainly resist the intentions of Alexander. And as we talked about with Heracles was, I guess, their main god whom they worshipped, and there was a famous temple within the city to Heracles. Now Heracles, as we know, was Alexander's ancestor through his father, through Philip, and so Alexander, as he approached Tyre, he requested that he sacrifice at the temple. Now the people of Tyre knew that to let Alexander into their city to sacrifice at the temple was essentially turning the city over to Alexander. It wasn't quite as innocent religious request as it would seem, and so they refused. And what they suggested was that Alexander might like to perhaps sacrifice at the old temple to Heracles, which was in the old ruins of the city of Tyre on the mainland. Alexander was insulted, and Curtius Rufus says he's lost his temper and shouted at them, "You think you are safe on your island? I will show you you are part of the mainland." I love that quote. And so Alexander then you actually need to convince his men that they could attack this island, which is 800 meters off the shore. The winds and the currents, the sea was deep. He didn't have any ships to really speak of. The artillery couldn't reach. How were they going to take this island? Perhaps having second thoughts, Alexander did send heralds, they sent messengers to the city of Tyre to perhaps say, can we come to some sort of solution here? And what's important is that heralds and messengers were protected by Hermes, the patron god of messengers. So to attack a herald was an act of sacrilege, which is important to remember. So some would say that perhaps Alexander was seeking peace with the Tyrians, or the Tyrians actually saw it as a sign of weakness, that after being refused the what we call it, the honor of sacrifice in the temple of Heracles, Alexander showed weakness by sending these emissaries. And that's how the Tyrians interpret it, and so they dragged the emissaries up, the heralds up, onto the high walls of Tyre, and in full view of the Macedonians, cut their throats and hurled their bodies into the sea. Now Alexander still needed to really convince his men that they should attack this city, even after the heralds had been killed in such a way, and so that night he had a convenient dream, dreaming that Heracles was on the high walls of Tyre, beckoning them on, and he was able to tell that to his men as one way perhaps to persuade them to attack Tyre. How to do it, as we talked about, slave labour. He drafted in labour in the countryside, deported entire populations, according to Curtius, all at spare point to come and do the necessary work for Alexander to attack the city. And he also demolished towns for the wood and the stone, and denuded whole forests in the hinterlands, the very tall cedar trees of the area, to attack Tyre. So this is not really mentioned too much, but I think it's quite interesting that Alexander would stoop to this level. Arrian tells us that he then gave a speech to his men, outlining some political reasons why they had to attack Tyre, which does suggest that his men were still not entirely convinced this was a good idea. There is some contention over whether the speech actually happened. I would say it's probably unlikely, and it's Arrian, I think, giving political reasons after the fact to try to justify Alexander's actions, which come. He did say that in the speech, Arrian says Alexander told his men, the gateway to Egypt, if we take Tyre, we can easily move on Egypt. The Phoenician fleet, the Eastern Mediterranean fleet, will join us, and I don't want to leave a neutral city behind us to easily side with the Persians. It is quite likely that this is also after the fact propaganda, particularly by Arrian, when really I would say that the attack on Tyre and Alexander's actions do hint that it was all about repairing a damaged ego that had been insulted by his request being turned down to sacrifice at the temple. And so Alexander built a mole. He started building a mole, a land bridge, out into the water from the old Tyre, the mainland, out to Tyre itself, 800 meters away. Seemed incredible, and the Tyrians were like, how's he going to do that when the sea is 6 meters deep here? But, as time wore on, the siege took 7 months. Alexander's mole started to get closer and closer, and he mounted his siege towers at the end of the mole as they progressively came forward. So here we have, this would here be deep and very, very tall trees were driven into the seabed and then filled with the rubble and the stone from the towns that Alexander destroyed. And as the siege towers came closer, Alexander started to use his catapults and his artillery to start to attack the city of Tyre. The Tyrians are starting to think, well, this is actually getting quite serious. And as the Mole got closer and closer, the Tyrians unleashed their awesome, cool weapon, the fire ship, which, as you know, is full of combustible material, and the naphtha in the cauldrons here, and towed towards Alexander's Mole, unleashed, and as it crashed in, the naphtha set fire to everything on the ship and actually burned Alexander's Mole and destroyed it. Now, as I talked about, Alexander showed some manawanui, and he built a second mole. He just kept at it, built a second mole heading out towards the city of Tyre, and this time to protect against fire, he had wet animal skins hung on the side of the mole to both protect his workers and protect them from any fire and sort of second fire ship that were coming again. Now, this is all good, but Alexander could still only really attack from one point with the mole. Remember, he didn't have a navy because he disbanded the fleet after the Battle of Issus, before the Battle of Issus. So how can he attack the city from a number of areas? At the moment, the Tyrians are still holding him off because he's only coming at one point. And what's quite cool is as the mole got closer, we talked about, the Tyrians were tipping cauldrons of boiling sand and human shit onto the heads of the Macedonians, which is quite interesting. But Alexander is still stuck. He can only attack from one point. But then the gods are with him, and the fleet from Cyprus comes over the horizon, and they've decided to join with Alexander. And so what this means is Alexander is able to attack from multiple points of the city of Tyre, and essentially this is it now. The Tyrians are doomed. And here we have the modern city of Tyre. As you can see, there's no beach, so getting the ships close enough is very difficult because the Tyrians were sending divers down to cut any anchor chains, any anchor ropes that Alexander's ships had. But eventually, there was a breach in the south wall, and sources tell us Alexander led that breach and was able to get over. Battering rams smashed down a few of the stones and able to get over into the city. And now, once the Macedonians were in the city, that's it. The Tyrians are doomed. And so you have absolute carnage, absolute destruction as the Macedonians go through the streets, destroying everything. They're full of rage after 7 months of the siege. They remember what was done to the heralds in particular. Okay, maybe they're fighting about Alexander being insulted as well. Absolute disaster. And talked about the heroic defense of the Tyrians. Many families climbed on top of their rooftops and were throwing the roof tiles down onto the Macedonians. Yet whole families committing suicide also, rather than face the wrath of Alexander and his men. Alexander being Alexander, while the flames were still burning, he sacrificed at the Temple of Heracles, which was his original request. Shame the city had to be destroyed to meet that, and part of the sacrifice was the battering ram that broke down the south wall. 8,000 Tyrians were killed, 30,000 sold to slavery, and the really interesting part, Alexander crucified 2,000 military-aged men and boys on the beach of Tyre, which really hence it's very personal. So, although Arian says the Tyrians had undergone the siege bravely rather than wisely, to face Alexander now, you need to be incredibly brave and confident, or just totally foolish, I would say. So, but in this outcomes of Tyre, look, Darius has been building up his army. He spent 7 months building an even bigger army to face Alexander. But Alexander does now control the Mediterranean, and the way to Egypt is open. We see his ingenuity with the mole. We see his manawanui, his persistence, keeping going. And this terrible message of fear that if you mess with Alexander, you are going to be exterminated. Most historians believe it was really personal, Alexander here, particularly the 2,000 crucifixions. That seems like an act of an impersonal, enraged man. And I like this medieval woodcut because it is Alexander, so this godlike creature with this haughty expression on his face, walking through, condemning this one to slavery, this one to crucifixion. Quite something. That's where Alexander is at now. And look at those images. This is apparently the remains of the south wall where Alexander got into the city of Tyre. And here's the city of Tyre today. And the really cool thing is I will show you you're part of the mainland, and Alexander did. Tyre is now joined to the mainland because here's the remains of Alexander's causeway. And over time that's silted up and the land was reclaimed, and they are now part of the mainland. Go Alexander. All right. Next story. Another city defies Alexander. I don't learn the lesson. Okay, ka kite.